Hey folks, so today I am going to show you the supplies that you will need for the 12 watercolor techniques. In the previous video, we have set up our 9x12 paper and we have our 12 squares with written on the names of the technique. From there, you will need a paintbrush. You will need a cup of clean water. You will need a paper towel. You will need some regular table salt. You will need a bit of rubbing alcohol, and I put some in a clear dish. Some Q-tips. You will need any sort of crayon, even if you did have another color, that is okay. But I'm going to use a white crayon for this purposes. And here we will start. So wet on wet. I am going to take my clean water and I am going to wet my square completely. So I am just making my square completely wet with just water. So I am painting water in my first square just to get the paper wet. From there, I will open up my watercolor, which you have access to in the office to pick up the supplies. I will take my wet paintbrush and I will wake up my paint by getting lots of water by waking up my paint. And I am going to just paint just a splash of color in this now wet box. And you can see that it bleeds out into the paper. So that is wet on wet. From here, we will go to wet on dry. So keeping this square dry, I'm going to go into my watercolor and I will choose another color. I'll be waking up that paint. And I'm going to paint this dry paper square with the watercolor paint. Some square that fits between these boxes. The next one is lift out. So I will have my Q-tips ready and still with a dry paper square, I'm going to wake up my watercolor paint and I am going to make sure that I have a nice juicy form of paint watercolor. Too dry and the lift out method does not work. Here is my Q-tip, and here I am lifting out part of this watercolor paint. Now I don't want to scratch the surface too much because then I'm going to pull up some of the paper. But you can see right there, I have lifted out some of the paint. Now for my blend right next door, I'm going to take two colors that sit next to each other on the color wheel, and I'm going to blend them from one side to the other. I'll start with yellow on one side, and I'm going to clean my brush. And then I will start with maybe red on the other side. And now with my brush, I am going to blend the two together. So you're going from one color to the other color, blending them back and forth, all right? And you might have to go back and forth between the water and your color, but the goal is to blend the colors seamlessly back and forth. So two colors that sit next to each other on the color wheel. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, yellow. Okay, so those colors are going to blend the best. Now, why wouldn't something like orange and blue blend well together? If If you were to blend them in either side, you might get kind of muddy in the middle. All right, moving on is crosshatch. Again, I will take my paintbrush and I will wake up that paint. And the trick to this is not to hold it like a pencil, but to slide your hand into the middle of the brush and or even further and lightly paint horizontal, vertical, diagonal lines to get nice looking crisscrosses or crosshatches. You don't want to write, we're not writing a book. We are pushing our hand into the center of the paintbrush and using our wrist. Okay, moving down the line, we have dot and dash. If your water at any point in time gets very muddy looking or starts to look like some sort of thick juice, get some clean water. Dot dash. I'm going to wake up my watercolors and I'm going to just make circles, or I can make dots. And my dashes, I can make long dashes, I can make very thin dashes, I can make thick dashes. The more paint I use without water, it's going to be very dark color. The more water I use with the less amount of paint, you can see the dots and the dashes are a lot lighter. More water equals a lighter color. More paint equals a darker color. Going on to the crayon resist. So if you take a white crayon or a yellow or even a purple or whatever color crayon, just like if you were at an Easter egg hunt or you did this with Easter eggs before, right? You can make all sorts of designs with the crayon that you might not be able to see at first, but when you paint over it, the wax from the crayon will resist the watercolor. So we're going to wake up our watercolors by using water in the paint, not too dry. And then you can see very clearly the wax from the crayon has stayed on the paper and it's resisted the watercolor. And now you can see my design that I have drawn. Going on to one of my favorite ones is salt. So dry square paper first. I'm going to wake up our watercolor and we're going to make sure that it's nice and juicy. We do not want to have too dry of watercolor. Nice and juicy. So water and paint. And from here, we take the pinch of salt, a pinch of salt, and you can drop it onto your watercolor and you can let it stay. So you will let this stay until it dries. Key, let it stay till it dries. If you start messing around with it now, you'll just smear it all over. Eventually, you will have a salt one that looks sort of this crystallized, okay? So let it sit. Moving on to the last row, our dry brush. Now let's be honest, this is watercolor. So you don't want a completely dry brush. So it's more of a damp brush, but still, you're gonna go in with not so much water and you're gonna sort of mix around the paint. Now, the whole point of the dry brush is to get more of a texture. So dry, which is basically a damp paintbrush, and going into the watercolor just lightly. But you can see the difference here and here. This is a drier brush with more of an opaque, thicker paint. This was a very wet surface with a very wet paintbrush. So the difference is the texture of how the paint is on the paper. All right, moving on, rubbing alcohol, a very neat, interesting one. So with the dry paper, you're going to wake up your watercolor. And you can also use this clear plastic top if you would like to blend some colors together. Instead of going back and forth and messing up the colors there, you can blend the colors in the top here. So let's see, I have more of this purpley color. All right. And I want this to be a little juicy as well. I do not want a dry brush technique on this. I'm going to use one of the Q-tips dipped in a little bit of the rubbing alcohol and be patient. And you can see almost like a petri dish type expansion on these circles. And this allows almost like the salt effect, but a little bit bigger. So beautiful technique there. And you let that sit too. And we have two more. Thick and thin is going to refer to lines on the paper. So back with your watercolor paint, wake up one of the paint colors. And maybe I want to maybe I want to mix it a little bit, and I can use this to mix. Now I'm going to go from very thick lines to thinner lines, and I can just do that by actually swirling my brush, and I can go from thick to thin, or I can do very thin lines. All right, from thick to twisting your brush from thick to thin, or holding your brush and just a flick of your wrist to get very thin lines. Thick to thin. All right, last one, we made it. We are going to do a gradation. The difference between the blend and the gradation. The blend is two colors, the gradation is one color. So I'm gonna make sure that my paintbrush has a good amount of water on it. And if you hear it ding, I'm tapping off the extra so it's not sloppy and drooling. And I'm going to go in and I'm going to wake up my watercolor, and I want a dark to light. So here is a lot of the paint. So it's a very dark color. And then back in the water again, I just want to go from dark to light. So you can see dark dragging that pigment with the water to light. And you can see another version of that is here, a lot of yellow, more water to very light. A lot of the paint, and then less paint, more water into very light. So there you have it. Here are the 12 techniques of watercolor that we will be using in class for this project. I hope you have success, and I can't wait to see what you produce.